Kia ora koutou katoa. Welcome to the Hoon, where co-host Peter Bale and I go around the week's news in geopolitics and Aotearoa's political economy with a whole bunch of experts, academics and politicians, all to understand our worlds better and have some fun. Kia ora koutou katoa. Welcome in, everyone. I'm Bernard Hickey, co-host of The Hoon, with fellow co-host Peter Bale, and we're both in windy, wet Aotearoa.
And Tamaki Makaurau.
Yes.
Which somebody said to me the other day. In fact, I was just having one of the things we're going to talk about today, Bernard, I hope, is the rise of the right in New Zealand and the feeding of it by our politicians. And somebody was saying to me today, Aotearoa doesn't exist, Tamaki Makaurau doesn't exist, and I just thought, it's getting kind of exhausting. So we'll go and talk about that a little bit. I don't, I'm perfectly fine with Tamaki Makaurau / Auckland if you must have it. I think I told you once, Bernard, I once met the current Lord Auckland. He was the current Lord Auckland at that time, which was about 1988, I would say. And I
take it he'd never been to Auckland.
He'd never been to Auckland, and I don't believe that any of his ancestors ever had been to Auckland as well. And but then again, nor did Lord Nelson go to Nelson. He just didn't have time. He was tied up. And I'm pretty sure that Lord Wellington, the Duke of Wellington, did not go to Wellington.
Exactly. No, great points. It's been a big old week, and I'm glad to be back. And thank you, by the way, for hosting last week's episode. I had listened to it, the edited version from Simon in the Bath, and it was fantastic, and I appreciate it.
Simon do it in the bath? You better be bloody careful without too many electronics in the bath.
I was listening.
Yeah.
This is one of my favourite things, is to, we're very lucky that we have a bath that's outside in the wild wind. And I fill it full of hot water and then sit and listen to my favourite podcasts, and that was the one I listened to.
You're the Archimedes of Waiheke as well.
Yeah. Our neighbours really enjoy my podcasts.
Yes, I'll bet they do. Now, Bernard, are you feeling good about being back? Have you thought, God, Europe's too hot, too far away? I'm sure you're glad to be back on your little island.
Yeah,
glad to be back in these islands, plural.
Yeah, and it's this is home, and it's our little haven, and we're very lucky. And even though it's wet and cold, it's always nice to be home. But we enjoyed our time away. This is a special time for Lynn and I. Every couple of years, we remember our wedding and our special time on a little Greek island, and we go and soak ourselves in the sun, and it's been a wonderful time. 30 days of absolute heat, and it got even hotter after we left.
Yes, it did. I mean, you would have roasted if you were still there.
Yeah, and
it was I think nearly 40, 41, I think it was in Seville yesterday. 36, I think, in Paris. It's pretty.
Yeah, and the place that you had gone to in Spain, we had a look at the temperature.
My place. Yeah. No, was 36 yesterday, I think. Yeah.
I mean, this is, for me, is a regular part of the job now, trying to understand what is happening with our weather and how it's related to climate change. And for me, one of the stories that we did this week that I think made a difference, and I'll be putting up an interview tomorrow with an expert on this, is that our media in New Zealand, shockingly, did not connect these extreme weather events in Nelson Marlborough last weekend with climate change.
Yeah, you would have thought so based on the frequency of it.
Yeah, and also the extremity. We know that climate change is going to make these events more extreme and more regular.
More frequent. Yeah.
Yeah. The question is how much and what research has been done. And I did a bit of work, and not that much, to be frank. And it turns out that the research was done at the end of 2023, showing that every degree of warming makes the intensity of these events anywhere between 10 and 25% more intense, depending on where you are. On the North and South Islands, and particularly at the top of the South Island, the west coast of the South Island.
Oh, really, Bernard? Where did you find that? Because when Dr. Catherine Dyer was on last week, and she is going to be on this week in order to trail her for the people who love to see Catherine. She was looking at a report from that remarkable climate attribution centre, which I think is at Imperial University in London. And it was all about the extra percentages and the likelihood of things happening had global warming not happened. So where did you find the attribution for New Zealand, Bernard?
Well, there's some research done by some climate scientists in the South Island at the end of 2023 using the data gathered after Cyclone Gabrielle and as far back as the weather stations in Aotearoa could tell us. And they built, using AI, a map showing the extent of the influence, the sensitivity of extreme events due to climate change, and expressed it as a very good heat map type thing. And I put it out in the email that we put out on Tuesday morning for subscribers. And there's a map, and I'll include a link to the research that was done. And what disappointed me was that there were dozens and dozens of reports from other media, and no one had done that work. No one had thought of doing it. We're now down.
Even RNZ, because Eloise Gibson from RNZ, is always usually very good on that kind of thing. And of course, because she left Stuff, it's not so much being done at Stuff now.
Because she's not editing every weather story at 3 a.m. that comes through, it wasn't there. And understandably, but that's where you build into your editorial processes.
Correct. And the news editors should say, or that should be part of the checklist of the reporters, have I explained and have I got the resources to explain what's behind this or what might be behind this without being alarmist? I mean, the interesting thing too, Bernard, and maybe we discussed this before you went away, but that journalist Ian Wishart, who has occasionally been the bane of my life, has been doing those exclusives at the Centrist, pointing out that, or using newspaper reports to compare with NIWA and various other people to essentially say that NIWA has been pushing a climate agenda for unjust reasons, unrepresentative reasons. This is a big issue.
The thing to do there, Peter, is to unsubscribe and get off social media.
Oh, but I'm sure
he's not a real
just
journalist.
a couple of reasonable mentions of actual facts, Bernard. I mean, who doesn't read facts on the internet and immediately abandon mad opinions?
It is a useful place, the internet. But it's great to go to sources with professional journalists and brands to protect and expand in a long-term way. And that's why increasingly I'm not getting a lot of my information from what you call the raw internet. I'm getting it through gate-kept stuff. There's a reason I pay for subscriptions to the FT, the Wall Street Journal, and many others, because people are paid money to check and do some hard work. And
at the risk of intruding on a soliloquy, Bernard, or creating a soliloquy, you do the soliloquies around here. But just before Catherine comes in, I wanted to talk, and partly because we did that skateboarding dog last week about Trump saying the word fuck and so on, which doesn't matter. But I was really struck this week. Somehow I've gone down a black hole on the internet through various New Zealanders.
I need to put a piece of string on your back, Peter, and then keep pulling. When you go down the hole, I'm going to pull back, and you're going to pop up and go, phew, thanks.
And I've seen
could have been bad.
Oh, I do go through these phases when I pull back a little bit. But this week I've seen lots about globalists and the WEF driving New Zealand. That the globalists are doing this, and we know what the word globalist is a code for. And so you've got these two sort of incompatible paths, which is New Zealand media doesn't do enough, and it's driven by globalist interests in the WTF, and then New Zealand media doesn't do enough and it's led by pro-Palestinian terror mongers. These things are all incompatible, and there's a weird path between trans issues, COVID, globalism, the WEF. But what surprises me is how many of them there are in New Zealand, how vocal they are, and how weirdly disjointed. And I was really struck by there's a new podcast come out this week by an Australian investigative journalist, which unfortunately I tried to listen to most of yesterday, but it's on a listener product that I can't actually get on my phone because my phone is still registered in England. But it really makes me wonder whether we've listened to the lessons from the mosque terror.
Well,
I mean,
some
one of
of
the
the
big takeaways was that guy, whose name shall not be uttered, had deep connections to international right-wing places, had given money to various places in Austria, and was a big buyer into the Great Replacement theory. Now, I've seen both sort of journalists, pseudo-journalists, and various pseudo-commentators on the right in New Zealand use that phrase this week of the Great Replacement theory. And I just think we need to know where this stuff comes from. The increase in family-related immigration was called out about this. Erica Stanford is being pilloried for supporting that and supporting various other policies which appear to be backing the Treaty of Waitangi as a part of New Zealand law. All of this stuff, to me, it's very risky and very dangerous, and our politicians have got to be really careful about pitching it. And so on a much smaller level, you've got Winston Peters this week saying that we need to have only one flag on government buildings. And of course, as you know, he hates calling Aotearoa or Aotearoa New Zealand, even though it's on our passports. And I just think there's a very dark set of pathways being put out there for us. And at a time when people are attacking genuine journalism and calling it fake news, the journalists need to double down on quality attribution, including on the climate, as you said, Bernard, but really calling out some of these dark paths.
It is tough because the moment you engage, as they say, when you roll in the muck with pigs, you get very dirty. And there's a part of me that just would quite like to shut the farm down and go back to the way it was. There's a reason China's government is relatively stable and seems remotely useful to growing middle classes, and that's because they control that information absolutely ruthlessly. I know there's a lot about China which is very bad, and there's a lot of things that a lot of people who are discriminated against and hurt and worse. But I think we'll look back in time at the way that we just gave up our public spaces to social media as one of the great mistakes of history, and essentially one of the original sins of the internet. But nothing that's way above my pay grade. And but it is sort of interesting. Welcome in, Catherine. Lovely to see you and to hear you on a week when the climate has been a hot topic, or maybe just wet, in Aotearoa, very hot in Europe. You might have seen some of the reporting I did and links on the way that the extreme weather events in Nelson Marlborough were covered in the last week. And you've been looking and thinking about this as well. How do we report on these things, at least from the mainstream media point of view, in a way that improves trust and understanding about the real science behind all this?
Yeah, it's interesting because it's an issue that has come up here this week, but also I just saw a comment from Michael Mann, who's a climate scientist in the US, about the coverage of the heat dome over North America at the moment, and complaining about the same thing, that the media is talking about the heat wave but not attributing it to climate change. And so just this month, the new study has come out. It's from a European research group, and the article is in Nature Climate Change Journal. I think it's open access. And the title of it's by Colonia et al. And a bunch of other authors as well. But the title of it is Extreme Weather Event Attribution Predicts Climate Policy Support Across the World. And so they have done a global study looking at, and one of the things they found, and we've sort of known this before, but it's really interesting, is that extreme climate related weather does not on its own necessarily predict that people will support climate change action or policy action from governments. So people just experiencing these things, that isn't enough to get them to want action to be taken. They actually have to attribute it to climate change. And so when the media is not is not doing that job and is not making the connection, connecting the dots between this is an extreme weather event and it wouldn't have happened without climate change, then that's, it's not really helping to get any action happening on it or to get any support for policy.
That's right. And that really struck me when I came back on Friday from overseas, having spent a month in very intense hot weather and seeing the reports from the likes of the BBC and AP News and The Guardian and everyone, in which that what I call the nut graph, the key paragraph of context that shines up in the story, that makes the first couple of paragraphs really fly. What they say are those things that have just happened, here's why they happened, and here's the context. And the context usually is climate change induced by humans is making extreme weather events like this more extreme and more frequent. And it was really notable when I came back to New Zealand and watched all the coverage of the extreme events in Nelson Marlborough, and there was a tornado in Waitara, for those people who missed it. Nothing. There was no paragraph like that. And so I did a bit of work on Monday and Tuesday to try and essentially create one. Turned out there's been some excellent research done in Aotearoa in the last couple of years. At the end of 2013, Greg Bodecker, a climate scientist based in the South Island, and a couple of others from Otago University and elsewhere, got some funding through MB to create an AI-powered tool which took the data from Gabrielle and going right back all the weather stations to essentially build a heat map, a type of heat map or a tool which allows you to work out when there is an extreme weather event, what attribution to climate change you can apply to it. So they worked out that Cyclone Gabrielle, about 20 to 25% of the extremeness, if you like, of the event or climate change made the event 20 to 25% more extreme. And they've worked out a tool which means you can look at a map and go, okay, when there's an extreme event on the West Coast, that's because of this percentage. You can attribute this percentage to climate change, about 1 degree. And when we're starting to think about 2 degrees, 3 degrees, 4 degrees of warming, then you better be sure you've got that paragraph ready so that whenever there's an extreme event, people go, you know what, it's probably something to do with climate change. Maybe I should do something about that. And that is important.
Yeah, interestingly, the kind of extreme weather that we're experiencing at the moment, which is heavy rainfall or heavy precipitation, globally, that is the type of extreme weather that is least likely to be associated with climate change by people. So it's especially important, when it comes to the kind of weather that we're experiencing.
And presumably in our case, Catherine, at the moment, the big factors are the rising sea temperatures, correct? That are contributing. That's our particular vulnerability.
Yeah, rising sea temperatures play a big part in terms of just the amount of extra moisture that's in the atmosphere, and so of course that drives heavier rainfalls and makes weather patterns that we might have been seeing anyway more extreme.
Yeah. Catherine, the other thing that's cropped up this week and has fascinated me is the downfall of the methane satellite that New Zealand paid about $30 million to stick up there and never got control of. Could you tell us what's going on there?
Yeah, it's a real shame actually to lose that that satellite. So this was a project in collaboration with the EDS, Environmental Defence Society, which is a US-based NGO. And they were particularly interested in looking at methane that was attributed to oil and gas projects. And so, we've talked before about, the argument about gas as a bridging fuel, and there have been some studies that have shown that if you have a lot of gas escaping from the process, particularly when there are long supply chains involved, that it can end up being worse than just burning coal for energy. But there was still a lot of debate about that. So this particular satellite was going to be focused exclusively on measuring methane, It was going to look at those oil and gas things, but in the New Zealand part of it, interestingly, we were more interested in looking at it in association, of course, with agricultural emissions. And a lot of the satellites that are up there doing this sort of job at the moment, they don't measure to the level of detail that would really allow us to attribute it to farming point sources. So it has to be a pretty big point source release of methane for it to be picked up. But this satellite was going to do it in much deeper detail. And then within New Zealand, the agencies that were involved in this project, they were also going to be looking at not only the top-down information from the satellite, but the bottom-up information to match it. So they were going to look at things like land stock maps and other emission factors that affect emissions on farms and paddock scale kind of studies. And they were going to match that up with the information coming from out from their satellite. So it was, it would have been an awesomely useful set of data that could be used to really plan ahead and work out what we can and can't do in the future. And unfortunately, it's gone missing in action. It stopped communicating with Earth, and some of that has been blamed on flares from the sun, which has been particularly active over the last few months, so they think that might have had something to do with it.
Yeah, if you were taking a conspiratorial mindset to this, and we know that that's not a helpful thing on most things, but
no.
If you were the fossil fuel industry or the big agriculture industry, you'd go, oh, that's sad that methane satellite blew up. That's a real problem.
Well, of course,
for us.
also, Bernard, it turns out it was funded primarily by Jeff Bezos. By a loan, by a grant from his not from Blue Origin, but from his Earth Defence Fund, from his own charitable fund. So good on
Jeff.
On Jeff. But
Eloise Gibson has done some great reporting on this for RNZ, and has had a particular amount of trouble getting information out of the American side of this project. Now, this isn't directly US government run or organised, but the concern I think some people had is that the American government now is actively going out of its way to stop this sort of data being collected and produced. It's not necessarily the case here, but there were some nervous people at Auckland University that they weren't going to get control of this methane satellite, that somehow the forces that be in America might frustrate that. And to find out, having been frustrated and not getting control of it, to find out it's gone completely must be just gutting.
Yeah, I gather what was happening over that time period is that the satellite kept shutting down communications to protect itself, and then they had to go through this lengthy process to try and get it started up again, and that was happening over and over again.
Oh, really?
Until eventually they just lost touch with it altogether. Yeah, so it was
they shouldn't have used Microsoft. They shouldn't have used Microsoft Windows.
Yeah. Well, as Peter Beck would say, it's not just rocket science. Actually, in this case, it is. And on that level, we're going to move to Robert Patman, I think, Catherine, because
Thank you very much,
Robert
Catherine.
and I are about to have a tiff.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Now, Robert, g'day. How are you?
Hi, Robert.
Hi, I'm fine, thanings.
Yeah. So you're the only professor we have on the show today, because Catherine is only a doctor. So we're going from 3 professors to 2,
What do you
and
mean
then
only?
now to 1. Yeah. But we know we have the best one. Couple of things I wanted to ask you about, or we wanted to bring up, was, and at the top of the show, I was talking about the coarsening of our dialogue, and I have managed to step into a couple of rather unpleasant internet conversations this week. I've gone looking for some of them, but there's some fairly unpleasant stuff out there, and one can put up with a certain amount of attacks. And of course, I found myself deleting something that I myself had said because I was at risk of being quite rude to somebody else. So I deleted it afterwards because that's not going to get us anywhere. And I wondered what your inbox and your social media feed is like at the moment, because I know there are a couple of people who tackle us both directly, both of us sort of jointly, but you're quite an outspoken person on certain topics, particularly around Gaza and Ukraine. But I imagine it's Gaza from where you cop the most, about which you cop the most.
Well,
problems.
I hope I'm not outspoken. I try to base, as an academic, you try to make observations based on evidence. And it may come out as outspoken if you have a very strong view on something. And yeah, I mean, it's coming back to your question. Yeah, I've noticed for the last few years that there are a number of people who, I mean, the favourite line is, "I'm not fit to teach students at university." That's the one.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah. And that, fancy allowing your children go to university. We won't recommend Targo University. But most people, on the whole, are pretty respectful. I mean, there are some people who act in a very rude fashion, but I think the process of typing, which is quite an anonymous process, and they don't have to see you face to face, means they feel people who have strong views on something are much less constrained than otherwise be if they met you face to face.
But do people go up to the vice chancellor and so on and say, Robert's part of an anti-Zionist, anti-Semitic campaign against Israel? Is that what they do?
Well, I've been simultaneously known as the head of the South Dunedin branch of Hamas, also a CIA sleeper.
Yeah.
So I just don't, for years I was seen as pro-American, and
Robert,
it's difficult to work out where I exactly stand according to these people, because I'm simultaneously on the left, on the right, and in the middle. Devil. So there you go.
Yeah, you cunning shapeshifter, you.
Yeah. That's right, shapeshifter. I think that was alleged at one point. But look, most people are very pleasant, and I do find there are some fantastic people. We all know the well-documented cases of unreasonable behaviour in the social media, but there are also some tremendously talented people offering information and analysis within reach for most people. So I don't think we should lose sight of the upsides and not just focus on the downsides. And I think for news junkies like ourselves, it does provide a lot of interesting material. Yeah. But there is an unpleasant element to it. And look, I'm sort of an experienced academic, but our university has been, and many universities are looking at ways. They encourage academic staff to make their research available to a wider public in all fields, not just international relations.
I think you've done brilliantly with that.
Well, thank you, but
you
not everybody would share that view.
No, but you work really hard to get to people, to reach people, and inform people.
I've always been a believer that I have this incredibly privileged job, and I have a chance to reflect. And most people's lives are very busy. Sometimes they have 2 or 3 jobs. So they're confronted with lots of information. If I can't necessarily add new information for them, but hopefully through training and a lot of scholarship over the years and teaching, can maps establish some links, some causal links for them that helps them make more sense of what's going on. I mean, I've from the beginning of my career, I've always taken the view that public education was important. Neither of my parents went to university, and my father was a bricklayer. Despite the views that many people have on the social media that I was a sort of part of the global elite who was parachuted in.
Oh no, you absolutely are. But the globalist elite, yeah.
That's right.
The
sort of Soros surrogate, But yeah, look, I think you've got to have a sense of proportion about this, Peter. There are people who are thoroughly unpleasant, but you do have the option of blocking them if they keep becoming really unpleasant.
I mean,
but the university is taking this very seriously.
Person.
As I say, people like Michael Baker and myself, who are quite advanced in their careers, they're not. We expect that, but for people beginning their career, it can be a very off-putting experience when you try to reach out to the public and someone doesn't like what you're saying and really take strong exception to it.
And I think that's particularly
in the scientific
true,
area. I mean, they do, as you can appreciate, that things like vaccines and that have become very controversial.
Yeah, and female academics seem to be particularly vulnerable to this, as we know.
Yeah, well, as I'm afraid, let's be quite frank, there's a surprisingly lot of men out there who believe that women have no place in public debate, basically. and or professionally, and it's regrettable. And but they do exist, and you confront it.
Yeah.
In the social media.
But Robert, you in fact sent me and Bernard a thing that I had seen just before we came on.
Yeah,
tonight,
I mean,
which
it's just
and I think this is what I was meaning about us having a tiff. That I have my initial reaction to this was I had a very different view, and this is
I
John
noticed
Minto,
that.
John Minto's group, the Palestine Solidarity Network, Aotearoa PSNA, has submitted a 103-page legal document to the International Criminal Court, citing Christopher Luxon, Winston Peters, David Seymour, and also Peter Beck and another businessman who I don't know,
as well as Judith Collins, I think.
Oh yes, and Judith Collins, the Minister for Space. I was almost going to say waste of space there, but that would be ridiculous and mean. Not going to be mean. But my feeling was that it was a ridiculous waste of time and entirely performative. Your reaction was actually to take it more seriously, I think.
Well, I haven't seen the document, Peter, and neither of us have. In that we've only this is breaking news. Neither
We've
of us
seen
knew
the press
about
releases,
it.
Yes.
But what I would say is there is an enormous sense of frustration, particularly amongst young people. I have the privilege of teaching young people, and admittedly, they're not necessarily a cross-section of the New Zealand public for their age group. But there is a bit of a disconnect between some of our politicians who seem to be rather relaxed or detached is probably a better way of putting it, from some of the horrors unfolding in various parts of the Middle East, and young people who are feeling extremely animated and upset about it and feel that the world is looking the other way while war crimes are being committed. So all I'm saying is I think that document, I don't know too much about the organisation that's produced this document, but I suspect they do have some people who are pretty passionate about it.
They do. They also.
I don't think it's an attempt to be a waste of time. I think it's an attempt, perhaps, to make New Zealand or put pressure on the New Zealand government to walk the talk. Mr. Luxon said New Zealand under his leadership would stand up for its values in the world. I think that's one of the concerns that some people believe that New Zealand hasn't when it comes to this. We've been conspicuously silent on a range of issues that have.
Well, have we though, Robert? Because we have had Winston Peters, we have had sanctions against Smotrich and the other guy, and we've been neutral.
Yeah. On the Israeli attack, the preemptive attack on Iran. Israel is a nuclear armed state, as is the United States, and then the United States promptly within a few days joined in the action against Iran. Again, in terms of international law, it's very difficult to see these as legal activities. It's not because we have any brief for the awful regime in Tehran, but you do have to be quite factual about what's happening here. Iran, according to the IAEA and also US intelligence, is a long way from having a nuclear weapon. And you have two nuclear armed states. So I suppose to some extent, I don't know this group, but I imagine this is an attempt to make New Zealand braver, as it was when it refused to support the illegal US invasion of Iraq.
Yeah,
and
seen
also
through that lens, I can see it, Robert.
And also, I think it's an attempt to get the US government off the fence. I think we've been trying to have it both ways. And, maybe governments do this all the time. I don't know. But I suspect that many people feel the New Zealand government has been quite brave within the UN, but outside it's been gone at pains not to offend the Trump administration.
Yeah, well, we'll put a link in it to the show notes. Bernard, you want to talk about the actual?
Yeah, events? I mean, just before we do that, Robert, you mentioned that New Zealand had been more, shall we say, has had a stronger backbone inside the UN than outside it. Could you give us an example of where some of that strength has happened? Because I haven't seen much of it or heard much of it.
On the 27th of October, 2023, New Zealand was the only member of the Five Eyes, and in fact the only country amongst the developed liberal democracies, along with Ireland, that called for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. And that followed the Americans vetoing a ceasefire resolution in the UN Security Council. Within the next 2 months, Australia and Canada, which refused to back the demand for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire, also joined New Zealand, and Canada and Australia joined New Zealand, and then they made 2 joint statements in the following year calling for a ceasefire. So there was a contradiction, though, which you may be hinting at or intimating, Bernard, which I picked up as well, which is while New Zealand was happy to vote with the 2/3 majorities in the General Assembly for a ceasefire, a lasting ceasefire. Indeed, Mr. Peters, when he went to the UN in April 2024, described the situation as a catastrophe. He also reprimanded the UN Security Council without naming the US, whose vetoes had kept the war going. But he said the UN Security Council had failed in its duty. Nevertheless, despite all that, within the UN, New Zealand agreed to send a New Zealand Defence Force team to deal with the consequences of the Gaza conflict, which he regretted, which was the Houthis' reaction to it. 6 weeks into the conflict, the Houthis showed their displeasure with the failure of the UN to bring a ceasefire by starting to target civilian shipping, which is illegal. And I'm not trying to make a defence of that, but it was interesting to me that, the government seemed to be a bit selective about how acting decisively when it came to the breach of international law. It was prepared to join with the United States to uphold the law in the Red Sea. It seemed less inclined to be proactive beyond calling for a ceasefire in the UN in trying to curb lawlessness in Gaza.
Yeah, but Robert, may I ask you 2 questions, because we've got to go to our last guest and to our second guest in a little bit. Mr. Nobel Prize Nobel Peace Prize is pushing this week, it would appear, a Gaza ceasefire, which would involve Hamas releasing, I think, the 17, I may have got this wrong, hostages that are still believed to be alive, and the bodies of the remainders. But of course, it would leave, to some extent, Hamas in place. What's your sense of where that is going? And the other one I'd love you to comment on, without forcing you into a stereoscopic sort of schizophrenia, is Ukraine and this quite brusque removal of approved and, in fact, weapons and ammunition that were on their way to Ukraine from the United States.
Well, that's not going to, on the latter, that will not achieve peace. That will embolden Mr. Putin. But come back to your first question. It was very interesting to me that Mr. Trump, I think, said earlier in the week, or maybe the end of last week, that he hinted that Netanyahu should not visit Washington unless he was prepared to do a ceasefire in Gaza. And also he said he was going to be, quote, very firm with Mr. Netanyahu. And I think there may have been some tough words said behind closed doors, so to speak. But it does seem that Hamas has managed to get some traction. You remember they released an American-Israeli?
Yep. And
that created, I think, some goodwill. The demand from Israel was always that Hamas release all the hostages at once. Until there was a ceasefire, Hamas have been reluctant to do that because they felt if they released all the hostages in one go, there would never be a ceasefire. So, it's an unfolding situation. I don't know too much more than you've indicated, Peter. So, it's welcome. Mr. Netanyahu reiterates that his goal. He just said this morning, our time. He said that his goal of obliterating Hamas remains intact, and he will not.
I bet he
will not take
obliterating
a
word
backward
too.
step on that.
The O word. And just one quick one then, Robert. What did you make, if anything, of President Trump's remarkable intervention in the Israeli legal and constitutional process to say that Bibi was being subject to lawfare, and that urging the Israeli judiciary to suspend its corruption investigations into Netanyahu? That seemed a pretty remarkable intervention.
Yes, well, I think it was solidarity because, let's be quite clear, Mr. Trump has faced his fair share of internal inquiries, including impeachment, and I think that's why he feels more comfortable with dictators, and he on the whole he doesn't seem to welcome, either in the United States or other countries, rigorous, independent judiciaries. I suppose he would believe that he's showing solidarity with Netanyahu. The relationship between Trump and Netanyahu is an interesting one. I'm not sure it's as close as many of us believe it is, but Mr. Trump has been a very solid supporter of Netanyahu up to this point. He may have felt, by one interpretation of this, Peter, may be that by expressing solidarity and poo-pooing legal proceedings against Netanyahu in Israel, effectively, criticizing them, he may help nudge BB to some sort of peace deal. That is to say, by supporting Netanyahu, he's encouraged him to move over to Mr. Trump's position on Gaza, whatever that is. I'm not quite sure what that is.
Bernard, last question.
Yes. Robert, how do you think things have, where the chips have fallen with the nuclear issue? It's been so much action. There was bombings, there was claims of obliteration, there was intelligence saying that things were open. We didn't quite know where the nuclear stuff was. There was a ceasefire. It all seemed to happen incredibly quickly. But where are we now? Because I'm curious about whether the nuclear issue has been put to bed for any length of time, and B, whether this is the end of it, or whether we're just in a holding pattern until there's another outbreak.
Or C, was the nuclear issue really the big issue, or was it regime change? On the nuclear issue, I don't think it's the end of it. And in fact, it was interesting hearing the administration say in the last 24 hours that Iran's apparent intention, or at least it's considering the possibility of withdrawing from the non-proliferation treaty, which would effectively remove scrutiny by the IAEA. But the fact that America's closest ally is not a member of the non-proliferation treaty and its nuclear capabilities are not scrutinized. When America says that's unacceptable, that Iran's considering this, I think many people will see that as a bit one-eyed. I think, sadly, and I said this to Peter and a number of colleagues last week, the sad thing about the Israeli attacks and the American attacks is that they have probably incentivized the repressive clerical regime in Tehran to move towards getting a nuclear weapon. Because the lesson they will take, had we had those nuclear weapons, Israel and the United States would have thought twice about attacking us in the way they did.
And they've seen the examples with North Korea, which has not been attacked and is still fine because it's got the bomb, and Libya, who gave up their pathway to a bomb, and before they knew it, they were gone. So it does seem to me that this has increased the incentives and the aggression of Iran to get their own nuclear weapons as fast as possible. But we shall see. Robert, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks again,
Great
as
stuff.
always. And
Thanks again.
If we can have tiffs as kind and nice as that, then and just for the if Bernard allows me any space at the end with his soliloquy, I might address the issue of the BBC and a documentary and various other things that have happened. Not that I want to step into too much more of this crap.
Cool.
Bernard.
Peter, thank you very much. And we welcome into the show Ed Miller from SICTAR. That's the way I describe the acronym. Can you describe for everyone what SICTAR is,
That was
Ed?
correct pronunciation. The Centre for International Corporate Tax Accountability and Research. We look at companies, we do company research, we look at profits, we look at how profitable companies are, and we look at companies that say they're not profitable and try and identify whether they are actually not profitable or whether there's something else going on. So a lot of the work that we do is focused on tax, companies, whether they pay tax, where they pay tax, how much tax they're paying, and whether they're contributing a fair share to the economy.
And it's often difficult work where you can't just ask them what they're doing. You have to do a lot of what I'd call accounting forensic work, which is fantastic. And it's really important in this multinational age where companies can often seem bigger than governments and push them around. And governments seem quite keen on applying taxes to workers and consumers, but maybe not so much to foreign companies. So you've done a piece of work on Uber, which you've put out today, and it's part of the reason to get you onto the show, so that we can talk a bit more about how Uber does it, so to speak, and what you've found. Uber, of course, just about all our audience would have used Uber. Maybe today they used Uber. It's a very, heavily involved in our economy. Can you tell us what tax they paid and what tax they could have paid or maybe should have paid if they'd been running their accounts in a way that New Zealand businesses run their accounts?
Yeah, right. So Uber in New Zealand has two subsidiaries. They're called Razier New Zealand Limited and Portier New Zealand Limited. One of those is the rideshare one. So if you're getting an Uber across town, you'll use the Razier service, and if you're getting a delivery, you use Portier, Uber Eats. Together in 2023, which is the latest financial reports that they've published, those companies earned taxable profit here in New Zealand of $4.5 million, and as a result of that, paid $1.2 million in tax.
Gee, only $4.5 million in profit, because they're
just
much
from
bigger.
you.
Yeah. This is probably from me. That's no. So surely they're making more profit than $4.5 million, because I'm guessing their sales are way bigger than that.
Yeah, and I mean the title of our report is The Business of Misclassification. Misclassification is the Court of Appeal last year said that Uber had been misclassifying its workforce, the drivers, that they had classified them as independent contractors, where they should be classified as employees. We think that misclassification sits right at the heart of Uber's business model. They don't just misclassify the workforce, they actually misclassify the entire business transaction, and as a result of that, they end up misclassifying their revenue and then misclassifying the profit that they earn. If I can cut to the chase in terms of the profit that they earn, because I know that's the question that you want answered. The vast majority of the reported revenue that Uber books here in Aotearoa is sent offshore, and I'll explain where in a second, to another Uber subsidiary, $200.2 million of that in 2023, which they paid to another Uber subsidiary as what they call intercompany service fees. These are essentially profits, but they are being shifted to another jurisdiction. We believe that jurisdiction is Delaware, because that is where Uber has said that they have shifted their intellectual property assets to, although it could be in the Netherlands as well. It's quite complicated to tell. And if you look at Uber's parent company filings, Uber Technology Incorporated, which according to the company's register is registered in San Francisco, but is actually incorporated in Delaware if you look at their regulatory filings. That parent company is the current, well, they don't explain anywhere where their intellectual property assets are sitting, but if you look at some historical filings from one of the Dutch subsidiaries that they have, they indicate that they transferred their intellectual property assets from the Netherlands to Delaware in 2021 and 2022. So that's why we think that probably the money is probably going to Delaware. It was previously going to Netherlands, and it could be that those Netherlands subsidiaries are licensed to use that intellectual property as well. It's kind of unclear, and there's different benefits and different structures.
So if they were actually, reporting like anyone else, it's a $200 and something million profit with the 30 something % tax rate or
28%
28% tax rate.
which means they would be paying about $56 million in 2023 in tax. So there's quite a gulf of difference between $1.2 million and $56 million.
So
Edward, is it my next question, Bernard, or are you going to, you go?
no, you go.
No. Edward, it's very good to meet you, and thanks for coming on. I want to talk to you again at some point because my team several years ago did the Panama Papers, and this is kind of directly related to this kind of offshore business. But we used to know this as transfer pricing. And I used to work at Microsoft in the UK, and Microsoft in the UK made almost no money in the UK, but it made particularly on advertising, but it made a shitload of money in Ireland. And all of my expenses, all of the costs that I accrued, I was employed by Microsoft Ireland, though working in London. And this is a well-worn path, particularly for the big tech companies. I'm sure Boeing and other people do it too, but it's been perfected by Meta and Google and Microsoft over the years.
Absolutely.
And yet now we see, this is going to be very hard to tackle in any meaningful way. I mean, Canada this week tried to impose its digital services tax, and that was immediately canned when Trump then threatened 20% tariff. So I think we can now see why all of these companies, or many of these companies, made large contributions to Trump's inauguration. I mean, this is not going to go. I mean, I think it's great that you're highlighting it, but getting something done about this is rather difficult when people want to ignore the OECD or forget that they're even members of it.
Yeah,
for example.
You're absolutely right. And look, I think the metaphor here is capital gains. 20, 30
Yes.
years ago, we applied preferential tax treatment to capital gains, and as Bernard will tell you, our economy now is a housing market with bits tacked on.
Apparently.
Trademark Bernard Hickey. Anyway.
Trademark Bernard Hickey, with all of the royalties to go back to.
I should have thought of that.
No, well, he already lives offshore. Did you not know that Waiheke is a tax
Tax haven.
Sorry,
so
did
That's
I?
a good idea.
Yeah.
One of the best kept secrets. Yeah, absolutely right. I mean, economics is the study of incentives. If we incentivize certain behavior, then companies, firms will adapt to that. If we leave the digital economy as a space that we cannot tax, then you will see larger parts of the existing economy transform itself into Uber-like services for delivery in a digital platform way. So it's hard, but we still need to find a way to do it.
Yeah. Do you think there's a chance here that our court system could help the government by confirming its judgment? It's obviously being appealed at the moment, but could that change things, force them to classify in the right way?
Absolutely. I mean, what I was saying before, that Uber misclassifies the business transaction, is central to this kind of discussion. Essentially, Uber's conception of the business transaction that takes place is not, they don't believe that the drivers are their workforce in any way, whether it's an employee or an independent contractor. The drivers are in fact Uber's consumers. The product that they consume is access to the digital platform, being able to use that digital service. And as a result of that, the revenue is the service fee that they charge to the driver for using that platform. They don't believe they have any relationship to the end user, the person getting the Uber ride at all. So as a result of that, their revenue is just a fraction. It's the margin that Uber takes, basically. So we would say, as a normal business transaction, that the margin that Uber takes is the profit, and that's what should be taxed, right? If the Court of Appeal, or sorry, if the Supreme Court comes out and says that doesn't make any sense, which is what the Court of Appeals said. The Court of Appeals made Uber's lawyer basically eat their words and say Uber had to accept that, in fact, the drivers do provide services to Uber. If the Supreme Court decides that drivers are employees of Uber, then all of a sudden that fiction is turned on its head, and the business transaction does exist between end users, and the service delivery exists completely here in Aotearoa. So all of a sudden that question of how much of that transaction we can book as profit here becomes one that is totally open for consideration, and one where Inland Revenue should really be thinking hard about what to do.
Yeah, because Inland Revenue's been doing a lot of work, employing a lot of people to chase down GST fraud, people who been declaring their expenses wrong, doing a lot of work on whether to tax double cab utes properly. If there's one government department that always gets their budget approved, it's the IRD, because they can say, well, for every dollar you spend employing new tax officials, I can give you $6 in tax. Why isn't the IRD working a lot harder on this? Because it's not just Uber. Of course, all of these digital services companies are using techniques like this. And surely there's just so much money lying on the table there for the IRD to go for.
I can't answer that question. It's a really hard one. I mean, I don't know what the incentives are within IRD, but it does seem like an interesting question of how you allocate resources to try and get tax revenue in the door. For me, bang for your buck, going after the digital companies would seem like an enormous benefit. I mean, if you take Microsoft, for example, Microsoft, if you look at their New Zealand regulatory filings, they register revenue of about $87 million. They have, or in the latest financial year, 2024. As a result, they incurred a tax liability of about $4 million. If you look in the related parties section of the financial statements, which is the one that I spend most of my time in, you'll find that there's intercompany service fees of $1 billion being submitted to some Google subsidiary somewhere in the world. Did I say?
You said Google then, but it'll be the same.
Google
It's the intellectual property, it's the Windows, absolutely.
Absolutely, and the incentives for these big companies of late has been to shift those assets out of the offshore tax havens back into the United States because of changes that took place in basically the way the US engages with the rest of the global tax system in about 2017. So that's what is now happening.
Ed, thank you so much for coming on to the show.
We'd love to have you back on again. And meanwhile, I've moved to Bolt.
Bolted to Bolt,
which is Estonian owned, but I'm sure it does the same thing.
I couldn't find any dodgy subsidiaries in there, so at the moment.
Oh, good. Let's give it a go.
Good, and we'll link to the full research in our show notes for this. So, Ed, thank you so much for coming on. Really
Thanks,
appreciate
Ed.
it.
See you soon.
Awesome. Thank you, guys.
Great.
Now, Bernard, have you in fact got a soliloquy, or shall I just quickly address this BBC question, which Polygraph, who's back on our audience thing, is possibly going to go ballistic about?
I will do a one minute soliloquy.
That would be a first. Go right ahead.
That's right. The New Zealand government borrowed $6 billion yesterday in a new bond. Didn't get a lot of attention. There was over $30 billion worth of bids for it. The reason this is important is that the government argues we are struggling to get money from the international bond markets. This is simply not true, and it's the central story the government is telling us and itself about all the things it's doing to cut spending, restrict investment, and it's just not true. Over to you, Peter.
Well, no, just a minute. Wait a second. Okay, so that's not true. But there is another country which is going to start having problems borrowing money and supporting its currency, isn't it, Bernard? I mean, you've written
US
a bit
and
about
the
the
UK.
Federal Open Markets Committee. It looks like the big beautiful bill is stuck in the House and may not get through. That would, I imagine, the dollar would go up if it got stuck, right? Bernard?
Yeah. No, it was certainly a fascinating situation where everyone looks at the trajectory of the US government's debt, which is headed for close to 150% of GDP. Remember, New Zealand's actual net debt is closer to 20% of GDP. And most countries, when they get over 100%, then things start to get really ugly. But America is different. It has the exorbitant privilege of having the world's reserve currency, where every bank and central bank and big investor in the world, when things go pear-shaped, will always want US treasuries and to have their money in US dollars and be snuggled up next to the world's biggest economy with the biggest military force and the most nuclear weapons. Let's be frank about this. And I don't see that changing, even though Donald Trump is obviously really pushing the boundaries.
He sure is.
There will always be demand for US treasuries, and there is no alternative, actually. Excuse me. There is no alternative. And
Christ, it's like watching Rod Stewart at Glastonbury.
Yeah, but with I've got better hair. No, maybe. And so I'm always a bit skeptical about those who say, everyone's about to pull their money out of America. The US dollar will soon be just like the peso. And, actually, we've heard this before. while it's the world's largest economy with the most nuclear weapons, that is not going to happen. And Donald Trump at over 80 will be gone at some point. The question is what he leaves behind and how much damage he does. How much damage he does. But, certainly we're nowhere near that point yet. At the margins, there'll be some movement, but not yet. And this is the thing about government bonds, and one of the dirty little secrets of the increasing widening of the gap between the richest and the poorest is that the richest have got so much money they don't know what to do with, and their first instinct is to put it in the safest place they know, and that is always, always, always US Treasuries. So there is an inbuilt bias within our version of capitalism.
Tunnel in Queenstown, but yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, over to you. And
well, I was going to say, I think if this big beautiful bill doesn't go through tonight, Trump is going to portray it as a crisis, but I think it's actually going to be positive for the dollar and interest rates and everything else. So let's see how wrong I can be on that, since I'm wrong on most things. I just wanted to quickly, people have brought it up on the feed, and I've been looking at it. So the BBC declined to broadcast a documentary that it had commissioned from a company run by the former head of Channel 4 News, Ben DePere, about doctors in Gaza and the claims that those doctors were being specifically targeted. Now, the BBC decided not to do it because of what they said would be a perception of bias. So Channel 4, his old place, has picked it up and run it last night, or run it our time now.
Good.
So it's on Channel 4 and on another show called Zetio, which is Mehdi Hassan's Substack-related independent news service. I haven't seen it yet. I would like to watch it, although I think it will be harrowing. But I really feel for the BBC. I often talk about journalism on this show. I really feel for the BBC in this situation, and also in this situation for Glastonbury, where they probably should have managed a live feed a little better. But as a friend of mine, Matt Kelly from the New European, wrote this week, are we really concerned more about a rapper at Glastonbury with a super that we've never heard of, with a super controversial, stupid statement, or are we concerned about what's actually going on in Gaza? And I think that is a good sort of calibration. And I really feel for the BBC in this situation. It's damned if it does or damned if it doesn't. Skateboarding dog, Bernard, is a tiny weeny one. So Trump this week opened what's called the Alligator Alcatraz, which is a converted airport in the middle of the Everglades, surrounded by. I didn't know actually that Florida had both crocodiles and alligators, because that's always one of those trivia quiz things about which they are. But it flooded about the moment after he left. It started raining and it's flooded today. But at the same time, he's sent officials into the real Alcatraz in the middle of San Francisco Harbor to try to look at the costs of reopening it, since it was shut by Robert F. Kennedy in 1964, I think, when the costs of running it became too much. But, that's what you get when you have a desiccated old man wanting to put the frighteners on people.
Yes. It's a stunning development, and it's sort of weird and...
but it does stop us focusing on important things.
Yeah. No, he keeps throwing the stuff at us, and
That's
there
right.
was that great phrase from the former Goldman Sachs guy, whose name I can't remember at the moment.
Steve Bannon, about flooding the zone with shit.
Flooding the zone with shit, and that is one particular piece of shit that is flooding the zone at the moment. It's so hard to stay out of it and to.
All right, last comment
focus.
then, Bernard.
Yes.
We had Michael Wolff, my friend, on some months ago. I dare not speak to him, but because I irritated him recently about something I said after that. But I can't recommend enough his Instagram feed at the moment, where he's doing something that I think you and I need to take a good look at, which is very short to camera, little 30-second to 45-second videos, usually done at the moment in his gorgeous beach house in Long Island. And that it is the most acute, subtle, digging, biting analysis of what's going on in the US that you will see anywhere else. It's fabulous. So I thoroughly recommend it. It's Michael Wolff's Instagram feed.
He needs to put it into Substack, and make even more money.
No,
But anyway.
no, he does not need to do it. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. See
Peter,
you,
wonderful
it's really
show.
good to see you. Thank you, Simon, Josie, our lovely producer.
And we say to you, ka kite anō. We'll be back again next week on The Hoon.